I love to preach and teach the word. I love to study. I love that. I may be doing 100 different things as a pastor during the week, but when I would get in that study on Thursday, it was renewing for me. If you don't identify your passions with your gifts and all, and not concentrate on building on that as much as you can, you're not going to be real happy in ministry or real fulfilled.
Welcome to the Pastor's Lab podcast, a new resource for helping church leaders think biblically and strategically about the local church. In each episode, we'll talk with thriving leaders on the front lines of ministries nationwide. I'm Ronnie Parrott, and I believe churches get better when their leaders are learning together. Thanks for joining us today. Joining me as my co-host is Pastor Clay Smith, the senior pastor at Johnson Ferry Baptist Church in Alpharetta, Georgia. I'm thankful for Clay and his leadership and his friendship. Clay, thanks for joining the podcast today.
Hey, Ronnie. So glad to be back, man. Second time. This is quite the honor.
I know, man. I'm looking forward to the conversation that we're going to have, and I'm certain the jokes you're going to make. Also, joining us each week, I'll have a co-host, and I'll have a guest that we will get to interview and talk about. And this co-host, or this guest, has a lot to do with our co-host, because this guest is the previous pastor who was there for 38 years before Clay came, which surely was intimidating to Clay, and we'll talk about that. This is the founding pastor of Johnson Ferry Baptist Church, Mr. Bryant Wright, who is also the founder of Right from the Heart Ministries and the current president of Send Relief. Bryant, thanks for joining us today.
Glad to be here. And I think you introduced Clay as being the pastor of Johnson Ferry in Alpharetta, Georgia. I didn't realize Clay had changed the whole campus to another city.
Did I say Alpharetta?
We are in Marietta, actually in an area called East Cobb. But we might. Who knows? Maybe we've changed everything since you left, Brian. We relocated the whole deal.
I do hear there's a multi-site future. I think Clay's thinking about expanding his presence in all the counties of Atlanta eventually.
All of them.
He's just really eager. As soon as he finishes his PhD, that's what I hear is next on the
that's right.
agenda.
That's what's next. I'll be planning campuses and prescribing meds at the same time. I'll be a doctor, so it's going to be great.
That's right. Sorry, Marietta. It's a great county, I hear. I do want to thank you both for giving us some time today to talk to pastors, to encourage pastors. The hope of this podcast is to really have a conversation as if we're sitting around the table together and letting others listen into our conversation. And you two have a lot to do with an important conversation around things like a legacy church, things like succession. How do you hand off a church that, Bryant, you love so much, and to the next guy, and do so with confidence and trust? So let's start here. Bryant, why don't you give us kind of the 1 to 2 minute Bryant Wright story?
Okay. That's pretty humbling. Well, I'm married to a great wife, Ann, have 3 grown sons and 3 daughter-in-laws, 7 grandkids, and came to Christ at 16 in high school through Young Life, but came up in a great Christian home. And really at the time, a very strong church. The Lord used a Young Life camp to help me really come to understand that personal relationship with Christ, and was called in the ministry after a few years in the business world, and thankful to have had that time.
A key part of your story is being the founding pastor at Johnson Ferry Baptist Church. And why don't you tell us a little bit about that story, how you became the pastor there?
Well, when I finished Southern Seminary, I knew I wanted to pastor and felt led to pastor, but Ann and I had met in First Baptist Columbia while I was at Carolina. I know you folks in Charlotte don't like leaving out the S in front of that, but being at Carolina,
yeah.
I met my wife, which was a big thing. And of course, Clay has a bias for that Carolina as well. But Ed Young had really had an impact on both of us when we were in college, and I asked him to be a reference. And so on my resume, when I was getting out of seminary, and he said, well, why don't you come on out and talk to us about starting the singles ministry? He had just left Columbia about a year earlier and gone to Second Houston. So the Lord gave us a detour there, but it was great. Terrific, practical doctorate in ministry, even though there's no academic credentials with it, but just learning about church and a vibrant, growing church. Also had to unlearn things too. When you study under such a influential leader and serve under an influential leader, there's great things you pick up, but also things that aren't you, that you just have to realize are not you, and other priorities. But this church was just getting started in North Atlanta in a suburban area that hadn't really taken off like it was going to. And they were meeting with a couple of retired pastors that would come in and lead a Bible study as they were searching for their first pastor. So we were led to come here. It was quite a big decision to leave staff like Second Baptist Houston, and having gone to First Baptist Columbia in college years and grown up in a large church here in Atlanta, to meet in a place that was meeting in a doctor's office with no land or building or staff, that took a good bit of faith. But we saw the potential for a new church in this community, and so thankful God led us in this role.
And God kept you in that role for 38 years, almost 40 years.
38 years, and I was 29 when I came here, and I had no idea. If I could stay in this new startup church 10 years, that'd be incredible, because you didn't hear of too many people staying that long in those days. But when I went on my first sabbatical, Ronnie, I visited 36 growing churches around the country of all denominations. It was a great experience. I know that doesn't sound like a sabbatical, but I was basically meeting with pastors of growing churches, and I learned so much. And one thing I came away from on that first sabbatical after I'd been here about 6.5 years was long tenured pastors. Everywhere you go, where you see growing churches, was long tenured pastors, at least for me on that sabbatical. And I remember very specifically saying, Lord, if you'd allowed me to have all my years of pastoring at Johnson Ferry, I would be so grateful. And thankfully, the Lord allowed that. There were churches that came along, but I never really seriously talked to another church other than maybe an introductory conversation where I would pray with them, but just never felt leading to go anywhere else. And thankful the Lord allowed that.
Yeah, I was going to ask you that, Brian. I didn't know if you had ever had serious thoughts about maybe pursuing a new opportunity, a new church, something else. I imagine in 38 years, you probably got a number of calls and inquiries that came your way.
There were some, and it was really more informal discussions. We sat down with a couple of search teams just because it seemed a little bit intriguing to think about, but really never felt any serious pull any direction. And plus, God was blessing Johnson Ferry, so it just, why be led to start over, especially because some of these churches that would come to us would be what I would call legacy churches now. And the freedom we had in being a new church and starting new ministries, pioneering a path, was far greater than what I thought would be years of going into established churches and hoping things would get going or underway. So really thankful the Lord allowed us to stay and never really talk seriously to anyone.
It was a unique time
along
to be
the
here
way.
in East. I'm sorry, it's a unique time to be here in East Cobb because it was such a growing community, and still is in many respects. But at that time, I believe one of the fastest growing places in the nation. So that had to be interesting, just to pastor in such a fast growing community.
We definitely benefited from the growth. It was a tremendous suburban community, just taking off. Great schools in Cobb County, here in North Atlanta. So there was a lot attractive about people moving in, and people were moving in from all over the country, often transferred in. Very corporate type folks or people that were starting or owning their own businesses in the community. Very business and professional, upper middle class community. And I was always drawn to that, having grown up in that and also been in the business world. And I just really have a passion about reaching business and professional people for Christ. So it was just a wonderful fit in that regard, but very different from when Clay came, much more established community. When we came here, Johnson Ferry Road was 2 lanes. Now it's 6. Just hard to find any open land where there was a ton of open land when we came here because it's been so built up now. So a very different opportunity for Clay at this day.
In 38 years, surely you hit some storms along the way, some challenging times, roadblocks, moments of which you just didn't know where the Lord was. Like, how's the Lord going to, work in this situation? I'm sure there's a lot of guys in maybe who grew up in that time where I did, where it was known for guys to go somewhere 3 years and then somewhere else 3 years, or when things get hard, it's easier for them just to go start all over. What were those things that really kept you moving forward in some of those more difficult times where you said, no, God's called me here? What kind of advice would you give to others who are maybe hitting a roadblock where they're at?
Well, I do think you always come back in the tough times to the call. The call of God carries you in those tough times when you really are having not so much second thoughts, but struggles. Am I going to make it here? And our biggest struggles was third and fourth years, maybe into the fifth year. And a lot of it was growing pains, Ronnie. And the church was just taking off dramatically, and we didn't have enough space and facilities, and having to improvise, and had most of our Sunday school classes were off campus. There was a lot of challenges we were facing, but also we had some of those early families. A lot of people that are drawn to a startup church, a plant, come there with all kind of agenda. And as they saw the church was not becoming what I would call a very traditional Southern Baptist church, they became increasingly unhappy about that. And so I began to study the Word in those growing pains about church governance, just to see what it says, and got very convicted that we Southern Baptists say we're a people of the book, but when it came to governance and elders, we're not a people of the book. We're traditional, denominational, much more than the Word of God. And so I brought this before what was the leadership team at the time. And of course, it would mean people in power don't like to give up their power willingly. And so it was a whole change there. And a lot of our leadership team was a church council. Women were on it. And when they heard that I didn't see any biblical leading of women being elders, oh my goodness, you should have heard some of the conversations on that. But I really didn't know if I was going to make it, Ronnie. I mean, I would literally wake up to have my quiet times sometimes that third and fourth year, wondered if some of that original group had a special meeting the night before and decided this young pastor just didn't fit here.
Man.
But thankfully, he carried us through that time. And even though I couldn't find a single Southern Baptist church that had elders, and I'm sure there were some, but I couldn't find any. We stepped out on faith and felt like we were following God's word on that. And from that decision, there was a growing unity that just continued to build year after year. And I'm very thankful. God bless that. Of course, now it's not unusual for Southern Baptist churches to have elder leadership, but in those days, I couldn't find anybody that was doing it.
The one thing I love about you talking to guys like you, Bryant, who've been in ministry for a long time, especially with the benefit of hindsight, is that it makes what at the time had to seem like such a huge deal seem more insignificant now than maybe it was at the time. And the reason I say that is because there's probably a lot of guys, maybe at the beginning of their ministry career, somewhere in the middle, that maybe they're facing an uphill right now, and they can't see the big picture. And I just love the idea that, you were faithful to God and that He oversaw everything that went on and was, blessed it and just kind of led you through it. And I love that, just, because everybody has a difficult time. It's easy when you see a church like a Johnson Ferry that people would think from the outside in is, healthy and everything's got to be easy there, and they don't know the journey, they don't know the story that got it to where it is today.
It was tough in those third and fourth years, and you're exactly right, Clay. People see Johnson Ferry today, and of course with your great leadership, just building on what has happened, it's probably hard for them to imagine that there were times where I just wasn't sure we were going to make it in those early days. But thank the Lord, He gave us strength to keep on keeping on. I remember praying this prayer, Ronnie, many a time on those days when I was wondering if I was going to make it. Lord, if these folks fire me, could you still work it out where I can pastor somewhere? Because I just didn't know what was going to happen. But I'll tell you another thing. I want to say one other quick thing. There were some lay people that were more new members, loving the church, loving what God was doing in the church, and honestly, they carried the day when there was very intense movement by the power structure at the time to go against what the pastor was leading them to do. They really carried the day. And I realize some pastors aren't that fortunate. Some pastors don't have that happen, and it doesn't work out. So I'm very thankful for some really strong lay people that stepped up and said, this is what the Lord is leading us to do. Let's keep moving ahead.
That's great. I've always appreciated that you are a natural leader. You like leading things. You like growing things. You have a heart for evangelism and missions. You know, your ministry right from the heart is geared towards serving people, and it's a heart for evangelism. Your current role as president of Sin Relief continues in that same vein, and I think the Lord has significantly honored your trajectory in life. Now, here's my question for you. You were a pastor for 38 years at a church that you founded and led. You could have easily stayed on and kept going, and many pastors would want to. In a lot of ways, it was your identity, and you could have, in a sense, died in the pulpit, kind of. But you saw the need to hand it off at a younger age, and I'm curious, like what was that like? How did you know it was time? How did you know, okay, it's time to give this to someone else and for me to move along?
Well, mentioned several things, and I know Clay will probably chuckle because he's heard these things so many times. But the first thing was leaving an elders meeting one night and was talking with one of our elders in commercial construction about millennials and just how they think differently. And he said, Brian, our atrium, which is a huge gathering place for us on Sunday morning, a millennial comes in there, they immediately know this isn't a church for them. I said, what do you mean? He said, well, they immediately know it's a church for baby boomers. I said, what do you mean? I love our atrium. He said, yeah, you're a boomer. And I remember going home that night and telling Ann after the elders meeting, I said, I think I'm toast. She said, oh my, was the elders meeting that bad? I said, no, the elders meeting was great. She said, well, what do you mean? I told her about the discussion. I said, look, we've had 7 capital campaigns for expansion facilities. The last thing I want to do is renovate our atrium so that millennials will like it. That's going to be up to my successor one day. And so she said, oh, you just need a vacation. I said, I'm not tired. I'm not tired. And Ann took about a year, Ronnie. She was really not ready when I started talking about that. But secondly, was a lack of vision. After I came off my sabbatical in 2012, after being convention president, the Lord had really put 10 kind of fresh goals on my heart for Johnson Ferry for that 30 to 40 year mark. And about 6 years in, 9 of those 10 goals had already been met by the Lord. And so I was kind of floundering. And I kept asking God for fresh vision. And I didn't want to just start some new ministry or new direction and do it in the flesh because God wouldn't honor that. And kept praying. Well, one of those 10 things was having a plan for succession. And I had implemented that with the elders in 2013. So it was a 6-year process we went through till Clay came in 2019. But that lack of vision, which is different from the mission, Ronnie, the mission is clear. Christ gives the mission in the Great Commission. That never changes. But the vision of those fresh directions that the pastor feels led to go to the congregation on, to move them ahead in carrying out the mission. And I was just blank. And so I felt like that was a huge sign that the time was right for a younger man to come in there. And then thirdly, we had been in a slight decline in worship, mainly because we have 2 styles. Our traditional worship had just been declining for 10 years. And it was so significant in the traditional worship that even though contemporary worship was growing, and of course, as Clay will tell you, it is so strong now and leading the way, but it was not making up the difference. About a 1.5% decline for about 9 or 10 years. Well, as a pastor, that'll drive you crazy. The giving was good. The new members was good every year, about the same new members. Baptisms very steady every year. About 2,000 people a year going on short-term mission trips around the globe. I mean, wonderful things happening. But that attendance decline was driving me crazy because I couldn't change it. And I really just kept realizing all those factors were entering in. And, it's interesting. I just finished the Crystal book, Ronnie, that O.S. Hawkins wrote, and I didn't realize it. But in the final years of Truett, George W. Truett, who was the giant of Southern Baptists for 50 years there at First Dallas, they had tremendous decline. Theirs was about 20 years. Well, same thing happened in the last 10 years of Crystal, 10 or 15 years. So, there's cycles in a ministry, and one of the hard things we pastors have to admit is that we've perhaps done our time. God bless Johnson Ferry tremendously. But it was time to move on. And so those are just some key factors there.
No, that's really helpful. And Clay came in and he flipped that atrium so fast. It was like the first thing he did.
What's so
He's like,
funny?
we'll get this thing
I
done.
had joked with man that my successor is going to have to do that. Well, that was the first building project in Capital Camp.
He did it so fast.
That's right.
He said, "We're changing this thing."
That's right.
Didn't take long.
It doesn't
this
look
is how
like
you grow a
movers
church.
now, baby.
I'm going to make my mark on this church.
That's right.
That's right.
That's right.
It looks great too.
Put some high top tables in here. That's amazing.
And yet he has real newspapers. He has real newspapers in the cafe. I think that's going back.
Dude,
years.
was one request I had, and for all the new technology, I said I'm old school when it comes to that. So I like to hold a real newspaper. So we have we get the Wall Street Journal and a copy of the Atlanta Journal and Constitution in there every day, and a real copy, which I love.
That's right. Two great
That's
godly
awesome.
resources for how to live life.
Yeah, that's right. That's right.
That's perfect.
That's right.
This sums up Clay right there.
That's right.
So 38 years, and now you're facing succession of a church that you love, and you're stepping into what you believe God's calling you to step into after a season of wrestling through it in prayer and feeling like the Lord's in this. You and Ann. So how do you approach that? How did you approach that? And what were the qualities you were looking for? I mean, you're going to have a heavy hand because of your natural position, so you're going to have a say in it. So what approach did you take toward making the recommendations and the kind of man you wanted to follow you?
Well, the first thing was
in any of that, really.
Okay. Well, in those 4 to 5 years before we implemented the process, one of the things I'd ask of the elders was the freedom to select the search team. Because I think when you've been a pastor there all those years, nobody knows the church like the pastor. And it is so silly in churches when they just shun the pastor that's been there 25 years, we'll cover it, he has no say. That doesn't make any sense, and it's not even biblical to go about that. So they gave me the freedom to do that. Now I had to bring the names to the elders, and they could adjust it if they wanted to. And then we also took it to the congregation to ask for their affirmation. But I think setting that up was a key. Now, on the search part, I was there in some meetings, and I wasn't there in some meetings. And I was there just really to answer questions, not to lead them, because I had asked 2 of our elders that were just in a natural position, so much background in their life to be co-chairman of that search team, that they really led that process. But I also asked them, I said, one request I have is veto power. If I do not feel good about somebody y'all are talking seriously with and have no peace about it, I'd like to ask you to back off. And they said they would. They said, we want that. We want you to feel, we want to see that you are excited about where we're led to go. But I felt like they should be leading in the decision. So I've been collecting names of young pastors for about 3 or 4 years. And when it came time to set up the search team, I handed off those names, 31 names, to the search team. I said, here's a place to start. And Clay was one of those 31. I didn't have any priority of 1 to 31. It was just a list of names. And Clay happened to be in the mentoring group that you followed, Clay's group, I believe, or maybe there was one gap there. And so that was really my first opportunity to get to know Clay. I hadn't even heard him preach or anything, but very impressed with him. And I think he would tell you, looking back, the group he was in, everybody except Clay was a guy that was in a large church that followed a long tenured pastor. And Clay was pastoring a medium-sized church then, but I just think that also was divine appointment there. We weren't even thinking about all that. It just kind of happened that way because of Clay's schedule, really.
It was God's sovereign choice is really what it was, Clay,
absolutely.
Right?
Absolutely.
Exactly.
And then we had Vanna Blumen. One of our guys is was a partner in one of the world's leading executive headhunter groups. And then the other guy had used Carter Baldwin and searched for a Christian school that he was chairman of the board in, looking for their headmaster. And so they were really big on having a search firm. And for us, that worked great. It was a win. They did a super job. It allows you to have a national search. So they brought to the table probably another 60 plus names that they were looking at. And then they kind of pared it down to 6 finalists, making it very clear to the search team that if you don't feel good about any of these 6, it's not saying we don't have any others. These are just where we'd recommend you starting. Clay was one of those 6, and each of those people were interviewed by the search team. I was just in the meetings listening to their questions. It was no doubt that Clay was the man to me that night that he interviewed with the search team, Ronnie, because the senior member of the search team was my original administrative assistant, wonderful lady, incredible Bible teacher. And I remember walking out of that meeting that night after they had visited with Clay, wrapping up all the others. I said, Claudia, what do you think? She said, there's no doubt who it is. And we both looked at one another without saying Clay's name, but knew that it was heading that direction. And interestingly enough, one of those other 6 early on I thought was probably going to be the guy. But his particular interview, and he's a terrific pastor and a very good friend still, but his interview time with the search team, after 10 minutes, I'm sitting there and saying, this isn't going good. This is not connecting. Whereas 10 minutes in the interview with Clay, it was just, this is right. The Holy Spirit is all over this. So that's one of those things you don't know how the end result is going to be till you begin to go through the process and start having those discussions. I may be giving you more info than you'd like to know there.
No, I love to hear the story and along the way how you're trusting the Lord and praying through it all. And I'm sure for Clay, on your side of things, I mean, I knew you when you were at First Baptist Matthews here in South Charlotte. What's interesting about this is, you know, your succession, Bryant, to Clay and how smooth it has been isn't the norm of what you hear. A lot of the times, a guy following the legacy pastor, the long-term 30-plus year pastor, ends up like fired within the first year or 3 or whatever. I guess the verdict's still a little out on Clay. I mean, that could technically turn. I mean, I hear there's a grumbling of people who hate the atrium right now. I'm just kidding. I'm just joking.
He's about to hit 5 years. I think he's doing.
Yeah, I mean,
Yeah,
5
that's
years.
right.
That's
right.
huge to be there 5
Well,
years.
we're
And
great.
I follow the journey. And I know Clay and I've walked through a lot of things together since through COVID and all kinds of things. It's been so fun to see Clay thriving there in the church, rally around his leadership. But how was it for you, Clay, coming in? I mean, how intimidating was it? Like, what was the posture you took?
Well, I'll back up a little bit. So I knew of Bryant for years. Bryant's oldest son was a fraternity brother of mine at the University of South Carolina. By the way, if you didn't catch that connection, both Bryant and I went to the University of South Carolina. So being a Gamecock it's wonderful training for the pastorate because one, it makes you very humble, and
That's
two,
right.
you don't have any competition in the fall, so you can dedicate all your attention to church.
I think
and
that's
worry about football teams.
That's the one thing that made you stand out among those other 5 guys, isn't it? Oh, he
No,
graduated.
Actually, I think
from
once they
South
found out
Carolina.
the church went, "Oh, are you kidding me? We're getting another Gamecock." I think that
I
was
know.
that was
See,
the
we
thought.
major
But
we major in humility though because we have the dogs in football we have to deal with, and then when you're the Southern Carolina versus the Northern Carolina, man, they look
Yeah,
down
that's
on
right.
those Southerners bad.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, that's right. Podunk,
That's
South
great.
Carolina. But so back in 2018, 19, I'm pastoring First Baptist Matthews, which, as you said, is the southeast corner of Charlotte, southeast corner of Charlotte. Loving it. I mean, we love that church. God was doing a lot of great things. I thought I would be there for much longer than I was, which was 5 years. But I'd been in that mentor group with Bryant, and I remember I was at a Panera Bread company meeting with a guy that I was just about to hire as an executive pastor. We're about to lay out this big, 5 to 10 year vision for the church, all this stuff. And I got a call from Bryant and just talked to him. And I'll be honest, at the time, my thought wasn't immediately, oh, yes, I definitely want to do that. Honestly, the thought was, who in the world would want to do that? Who would want to go follow a founding pastor? But we prayed about it and decided that we would enter the process and just see what the Lord does. I had a mentor in life. I used to work for someone that Bryant knows, Dick Lincoln, used to be at Shandon for a long time. And I remember Dick used to say all the time, he said, when search teams call you, on the whole, you should talk to them. I mean, not if you get a call every month or something, I guess not. But every now and then you should talk to them. He said for 2 reasons. One, either the Lord is leading you to a new opportunity, or, and this is more often the case, it just reaffirms your commitment and your call to where you are right now. And so that was my mentality. I thought, well, we'll enter the process and we'll just see what happens. And fast forward over several months, and obviously the Lord called us to come to Johnson Ferry. But at the time, I mean, to be honest, I had some trepidation just because, like you said, Ronnie, you don't want to be the guy after the guy. I mean, that's a general rule. I joke. I'll use an old sports analogy that a lot of guys our age don't know, but Ray Perkins was the coach after Bryant, and barely anybody's heard of him. I mean, you want to be Gene Stallings. He was the guy after the guy who won a national championship. And in church world, that's often the case. There's a quote unquote sacrificial lamb after the founding guy. And then you want to be the guy after that. So I had all those thoughts and fears, but those are all laid to rest very quickly for a couple of reasons. One, we really loved the people as we got to know the search team, and as that circle began to expand into other people in the church, there was just such a common affinity and a love for this church, a love for the people, a love for the city. I think we're a good culture fit here. So a lot of things like that very quickly helped us to bond to this place. And then the other thing, I want to give Bryant a lot of credit. I think a lot of our success is because of his humility and his intentionality in the process. And I know he would give credit to a lot of other people, and there are other people give credit to. But like he said, for years before they even knew my name, they had a plan in place that they were working off of. And so there's intentionality there. And then secondly, the humility comes in because by the time I got here, for the most part, it seems like Bryant had worked through a lot of the emotional grief of leaving a church. Not to say that you didn't have to deal with that after you left. I'm sure you did. I'm sure we all will. But I see a lot of guys who just haven't dealt with the emotional side of leaving, and they're really not emotionally ready to leave. And so when the reality of the new guy shows up, they really, really struggle with that. And if you just think about the analogy of handing a baton from one runner to the next runner, they really struggle to let that baton go. But I would say, to Bryant's credit, he did nothing but put wind in my sails, as he was leaving. And the other thing is that we decided to do somewhat of an overlap. So we shared about 3 months together. Both, I guess you will, being the senior pastor, which is probably a little awkward for all of us, probably a little awkward for the church. We started to use words like outgoing and incoming. But the great benefit of that time together was that I think we became friends. I think had he had left, so a lot of churches do it like this. The longtime guy decides, I'm going to leave for very good reasons, and decides to leave, and the new guy comes in, and there's very little interaction publicly between the two. And I think the thought behind that is, from the outgoing guy, I don't want to get in the incoming guy's way. I want to just let him do his thing, not be a burden to him, not, an obstacle to him. I think the detriment of that is that it doesn't help the church transition from one leader to the next. So I think the public nature of us working together for 3 months was very helpful for the church. So we did a joint sermon series together. We did a big fundraising thing where we raised a huge offering for missions, which is tremendous that we got to do that together. And I think we just became friends together. So it was a very healthy process. But Brian gets a lot of credit for that.
Ronnie, I know we're passionate about this and so close to our heart, but I'd like to add about why I feel like Clay has been such a smooth transition. First of all, I feel our priorities are simple. Just the type of things that charge Clay up in leadership and preaching, those kind of things, I think are similar. And of course, obviously, Clay brings strength to it that I didn't have. And that's just part of bringing a new person in to bring fresh life. But also, he really wants to see people come to Christ. And I think also has embraced even maybe more. Now, Clay, you can clarify this if I'm off, but I feel like maybe even embrace global missions more.
Yeah.
Entering a global missions culture like Johnson Ferry has. And he is carrying it to the next level in the sense of being called out and sent out from the church, which is so exciting for me to see. I'm so thankful. But here's one other thing I think is the most overlooked with the successor. He is a cultural fit. He's God's man. He's a man of the word that teaches the word. He's got the priority on evangelism and missions. when you come into Johnson Ferry, the average job, 98, what, Clay, 98, 99% college educated and above. Well, every one of those people, the adults, are making a decision, can I connect with this guy? And the beautiful thing about Clay is real quickly they say, yes, I can connect with this guy. He's thinking like he understands the world I'm living in. He's interested in a lot of the things I'm interested in. He can speak on an intelligent level about the word and life in general. And so I think search teams way underestimate cultural fits in thinking about a new pastor. Our very first church plant, Ronnie, we let the group that was sent out to a northern part of this Cobb County, and they called a guy, bless his heart, good, godly Christian man, but he was a blue collar guy in a white collar community, and they fired him within a year. Well, we learned that that was a mistake. I mean, here was a guy that was really a fine Christian guy, but he just wasn't a cultural fit. Yeah. And I think churches really underestimate that in thinking about succession.
Scott, I appreciate you guys, and I'll tell all of our listeners today. Bryant has written a book on this with Clay on the idea of succession called Succession: Preparing Your Ministry for the Next Leader. And you can pick that up on Amazon or wherever you shop, I'm sure. I would encourage you guys to pick it up. It's an interesting book. And again, both significant leaders who have a lot to teach others. And I'll say this, or I'll ask this, there's a lot of people listening here who may be a little older and wrestling through succession of their own. What advice would you give to other senior pastors who are considering retirement or passing on the leadership mantle to the next guy?
Want me to start, Clay? Or?
Yeah, please do.
Okay. Well, I think, first of all, we got to realize we're all interim pastors, and we're thankful for the years that the Lord allows us to be where we are. But if we're really looking at it right, we're not the only guy that's going to be pastoring that church. And so anybody that is, to me, early 60s on, needs to be talking with the leadership of the church that we've got to have some general game plans here, because for one thing, the pastor could get sick and die more likely at that stage, or who knows what could happen, but also just lack of energy for the future, all those kind of things. So I think you really need to begin far sooner than you think in coming up with a basic game plan so you can be very intentional about the process. But I think also when that time comes and when the new person is identified, and Clay and I were fortunate to have about 3.5 months overlapping, which I think I second what Clay says, the church could visually see the transition taking place. It was just really, we approached that very systematically. I led the meetings the first month, Clay was there. The next month we shared the leadership. Meeting the third month, Clay was leading all the meetings, deacons, staff, whatever. I was just there. So it was a very intentional handoff. And then the senior guy has to be clear on an end date and stick to it. You read these horror stories about succession don't work out. And what often happens is the senior guy just can't let go. And he says, well, we just need a few more months. It's just hard to let go. You got to let go. You got to have a date and stick with it. And then you can make all your healthy handoff plans back from that date. And I think that helped at Johnson Fair, where everybody knew when the end date was while Clay was already there. And one other thing, I moved out of my office when Clay came, not when I left, but when Clay came. And I think, once again, with the staff and everybody, that symbolized, hey, there's a new sheriff in town. And
yeah, I think at the time I wouldn't have appreciated that, but in hindsight, that is a big deal, Bryant. I mean, there's a lot of symbolism in that even by the time I came, Ronnie, so to let the listeners know, in the first couple months, I mean, I redid the office and that kind of thing, made it feel a little bit more like me, which is pretty normal for most people. But just the fact that he had moved out, and Bryant then took his old office, which is a very smaller office on another part of the building. I mean, there's just a lot of symbolism in that of just servanthood and humility on Bryant's part. And again, I can't give him enough credit for what he did, because the reality is that in terms of the human element, the outgoing pastor holds most of the cards. I mean, as an incoming pastor, you have some, but the outgoing pastor has most of them. So a lot of the burden
Right.
falls to the outgoing guy to handle this well.
You've got the chips. I mean, you got 38 years. There's a lot of relational chips there. And the new guy, you can't possibly expect him to have all those chips
Yeah, sure.
right out of the bat. At the same time, where Clay has been so strong, and where I think the new guys that follow a long tenure pastor want to keep in mind, is he has really shown great respect to me. And I can't tell you how appreciative I feel, and Ann and I feel in that regard. He doesn't have to do that. And I'm sure he gets tired of hearing how Bryant did things and all that. Man, that would drive me crazy. But he has been publicly very respectful. That means a lot. It really does. I mean, he's even having me preach on Father's Day coming up. Still lets him come back and preach.
Yeah.
Okay.
And we love it. I mean, you probably average preaching at least once a year over the last 5 years, and you come back for other things. And, Brian's a very busy man. I can barely get on his schedule. I mean, he's gone every weekend preaching somewhere. So we're just grateful to have him back. But I'll tell you one other thing, Ronnie, for guys listening in the transition. Well, there's several things I could say, but one is you got to think about the different constituents, parties that are involved in a transition. And really there are four, and all have to be managed in different ways. I mean, you have the outgoing pastor, the incoming pastor. Those are the two most public. Of course, you have the congregation and whatever role the congregation plays. But I'll tell you a fourth that is often overlooked, and that is the pastor's wife. And I don't mean that necessarily from a power play, though I know some churches, the pastor's wife does have a much more dominant role in some kind of way. I just mean in terms of their identity, their role in the church. I think that's hard for the outgoing pastor's wife in a way that maybe they don't consider. That's not to say you didn't, Brian, or Ann didn't, but you retire and you're still the former pastor, you're doing other things, but once you retire, a lot of their identity kind of goes out the window, or at least it's up. I'd love to, maybe there's a pastor listening and there's an element just for his wife. I mean, what encouragement would you give to a pastor in that situation?
Well, I would say this, Manderblumen was the one that pointed out that usually the big problems occur when the retiring pastor's wife won't let go. And when I told Ann that about 3 years before we got this process underway, boy, that scared her to death to even think about that. At the same time, it's been harder for Ann than for me. It really has. It's harder for Ann to go back because she was the pastor's wife, and now she goes back and doesn't really know. One, she feels embarrassed when all these people say, "Oh, we're glad to see you," that kind of thing. I mean, and we're not there. Clay will tell you, we're probably there about once every 2.5, 3 months because I'm preaching in other churches most Sundays, but it's harder for her. I've enjoyed going back. I love going back, seeing how great it's going, all these people I've never seen before. And Clay's just doing a wonderful job, but and I don't even know if I can verbalize it for Ann, but she has said with like our Mega Metro group, Clay, that of our generation, almost to every person, it's been harder for the pastor's wife when that separation time comes. She just feels kind of floundering out there.
Yeah, and I can only imagine. I would probably feel the same way. It's been so encouraging in the last couple of weeks. She's come a couple times without you, and we very much applaud that. We're so glad to see her and hugged her, and because we love Ann and everybody loves Ann and she's awesome. So, but yeah, I just think in the conversation, almost no one talks about the pastor's wife, and it's a really big deal. And there's some situations where it was the make or break deal, for a lot of reasons.
Yeah.
Brian, I'll ask you here, you're one of the guys who have been so faithful throughout your whole ministry. I mean, the Lord has given you all kinds of opportunities, all kinds of inroads, from pastoring and preaching in various places to previous president of the Southern Baptist Convention. What would you say to the guy who says, "Hey, how have you finished well? How have you remained faithful through it all?" Like what kind of advice would you give him?
Well, thank you for asking that. That's something I feel passionate about. I think, one, be sure you got a life purpose statement that is portable. You guys being in the mentoring groups, I have had a life purpose statement for years. And when I was no longer pastor at Johnson Ferry and now leading Sin Relief, my life purpose statement hadn't changed. It shouldn't be bound by the vocation you're in, by the by the role you're in. It should be much bigger than that. But that is a key to me to finishing strong, because when you have a life purpose statement, then you know where to say yes and where to say no a whole lot more. Not always easy, but you still have a better idea of who you are. And I think the basic things, Ronnie, I can't say enough about quiet time. It may seem so obvious to everybody, but I guarantee you, I couldn't survive a week or two as senior pastor at Johnson Ferry without a daily quiet time. I wouldn't have the wisdom, I wouldn't have the strength, I wouldn't have the want to without having that time with Jesus. And I do think so many people begin to confuse their ministry with their relationship with Jesus, and that's spiritually deadly. You just wind up being a professional that has no spiritual power in your life. I think Sabbath is huge. Weekly Sabbath, I just am passionate about. 24 hours away from your main job. However you go about doing that is so refreshing. I think also staying with things that you're passionate about. I love to preach and teach the word. I love to study. I love that. And my juices get rejuvenated. So I may be doing 100 different things as a pastor during the week, but when I would get in that study on Thursday, it was renewing for me to begin gearing towards Sunday. Well, if you don't identify your passions with your gifts and all, and not concentrate on building on that as much as you can, you're not going to be real happy in ministry or real fulfilled. That, along with leadership and team building, those kind of things, just really, I love that. So those are some basic things that I think are very obvious, but are so neglected. And I hope you would encourage anybody you can to help their church develop a sabbatical policy for the ministerial staff, because I think that was a huge reason for longevity. And it's also interesting, and Clay, I'd love to hear your perspective, because we really hadn't talked specifically on this, but there's been a huge shift in the staff in the time Clay's been there, because there was such long tenure, mostly boomers that I was serving with, and we had our day. I mean, it was time to have a new leadership team of the next generation. I think almost all of that has really happened naturally. It's Clay's handled that beautifully, and being patient about some things where it's probably been a little hard to be patient. But I think that's another thing that you want to identify. It's not just the senior pastor leaving, but if he's had a staff with him for a while, you're going to have a lot of folks there that you have to think about in the transition. And so I'm glad I had all those years with so many great guys on the staff, but I'm also glad that it's really basically a new team that Clay's. The younger guys that were on our team are largely still there, but it's a new team that's in the leadership role. And Clay, you have any thoughts on that? Because it really has happened pretty amazingly well to me.
Yeah, we've had a huge, I mean, like a lot of churches, we had our own version of the Great Resignation, in 2021, 2022. So some of that was a part of the transition. Some of that was COVID and people just deciding I want to do something different with my life. We didn't have to do some kind of mass layoffs or that kind of thing, but yeah, it's by and large, it's the whole executive team, which is made up of 5 of us, is all brand new. I mean, 2 are internal guys that we promoted up into larger roles, but all brand new. And even to that point, I'm the second oldest person on our executive team, and I'm 45. So it just tells you, we should probably do some podcasts, Ronnie, on leading 20-year-olds, because that's a whole different deal.
Right.
Because there's some awesome things about it and some really challenging things about that.
It is the most challenging thing to do.
Yeah. Some of those boomers I miss, Brian, for a lot of reasons, but yeah, so totally new team, and I think that's natural and healthy, because you want it to be quote unquote your team, people that are kind of representative of what you think you need for the future and that kind of thing. But yeah, the team element is certainly huge. Ronnie, in terms of maybe some advice for the incoming guy, because maybe someone's listening to this that's about to take over a role like this. I mean, there's a lot of things that I think we said that have been helpful to that. A couple that I would mention. One is, like we said, it's so important to honor your predecessor. I just think that is so huge, and to do that publicly. And hopefully you're doing it in an authentic way that you really mean it. You're not just doing it as some kind of leadership tactic. But to honor them is so important, I think, for the church. It's so easy when you come in, and this is a mark of insecurity, is to kind of prove that you're a better leader or that you're different. You kind of go out of your way to make sure everyone knows that you're different, or it's so easy to throw your predecessor under the bus. And so honoring your predecessor is really important. The second thing I would say, and this is big for anybody, particularly for an incoming guy, is just to be comfortable with who God has made you to be. Because there's a lot of pressure there's a lot of self-imposed pressure to feel like I've got to be my predecessor 2.0. And the reality is you just have to be who you are. And, I've told this story with Bryant several times, but my very first sermon here, I made somewhat of an offhanded comment. I didn't mean to make it, but I think it was very helpful for the church. The weekend that we came here to do the In View of the Call, if you're not a Baptist listening to this, I'm not going to explain what that is. But anyways,
Yeah.
it's like your first, your big first sermon. I was at the grocery store somewhere, CVS, and something came up about Johnson Ferry, and I said, "Yeah, I'm going to be the new pastor there." And Bryant Wright. He said, "Well, it's a big shoes to fill, And I kept hearing that comment, big shoes to fill. And I just told the church, I said, with all due respect to Bryant, I'm not here to fill his shoes. I'm here to fill my own shoes. In other words, I'm here to do what I sense God's called me to do, and to be the person that God's called me to be. And Bryant and I are very much alike in terms of our DNA of ministry, but there's some differences between he and I in personality and gifting and wiring and all that. And so you just got to be you. So that's the second thing. And then maybe two other things I'd say. Thirdly, find a way to help your predecessor finish strong. And so in our case, we did a 3-month overlap, 3.5-month overlap. So I felt like, even though it was a little awkward coming in, because I had been a senior pastor and was used to being the lead guy, and then you come into a new church, that day's coming, but for 3 or 4 months, it's a little bit of a two-headed monster, and it feels a little awkward. But I resolved, in these 3.5 months we're together, my number one job is to help him to finish strong, whatever that looks like. And I think that was a huge benefit for the church, and a big benefit for our relationship. And it goes back to the honoring thing. And the last thing I'd say is the great challenge of taking over a healthy church, which is different than coming into a church where maybe you're doing a revitalization work. I would say going into First Baptist Matthews, though it has a long history, over 100 years old, I went to a situation that was difficult. They had had several years of decline, some mistrust with staff and a pastor. And so I had to do it was definitely a rebuilding, revitalization type work. Well, this wasn't that. You're coming to a really healthy place. No church is perfect, but Johnson Ferry is very healthy and thriving and growing. And so the challenge is, how do you lead a healthy organization, a healthy church? And so I would say this, the fourth thing is, you have to do what you can to help the church see that their best days are ahead of them.
Yeah.
And there's so many wonderful memories you're building off of, but you have to lead into the future. You want to build off the past, so you don't want to neglect the past or forget the past, but you have got to do what you can to help them look ahead to not where God was, but where God is and where God is leading us to be. And that is much easier to say than to do. But I think as an incoming guy, in the right time and in the right way, that's got to be your priority.
Ronnie,
That's
kind of
so
real
good.
quickly, we may be going too long here, but as Clay talks about honoring the senior pastor, I hope the listeners aren't thinking that we guys just, we got to really be built up for how wonderful we were. It's really not that. Think about it this way. I imagine you have counseled people that have gone through a divorce, that whatever you do, don't put down your ex in front of your kids, because that crushes your kids. It just crushes your kids. You're only hurting your kids. And so think about it that way. I mean, here's a pastor who's been here 38 years. There's a lot of long-term relationships. If Clay didn't express honor, it just hurts them. I mean, because there's a loving relationship there. And a lot of their identity is with that previous guy, just like children's identity is in both parents. So I think it's really that. I mean, you're just being wise about recognizing there's some long-term, meaningful relationships, and it only helps the new pastor to do this, because it comes across that you're a big man. You're comfortable in your own skin, that you can build up a guy who has already got the chips with the people and the sense of the respect of the people. So I just think I want to clarify why that's important in thinking about the harmony in the church there.
That's good.
That's great. Brian, let me ask you one other question here. I know that you have mentored a lot of pastors, myself included. You've taken a lot of guys through your mentoring program, and you're still doing it. As you reflect on the current state of the culture, what are your hopes and aspirations for the future of the church? Like what is it you're most hopeful about?
Well, I love being with you guys. And, I hear about our peers that go move to these 55 and up in communities. And I think, Lordy mercy, that'd be miserable just to be with our generation. I love being with the younger guys.
Also, hey, I've heard some really shady stories from those 55 plus communities.
Yeah,
there's some real.
Yeah,
you
should not go there. Stay away. Don't
stay
go.
away from those places. Yeah.
That's right. But I love being with younger guys, and I want to say this to my generation that misses it so bad here. Man, these younger guys I'm with, like y'all, love the Lord. They preach the word. They believe the word. They want to see people reach. It's just, man, it's so encouraging to say, dress funny. They dress funny. But that's just part of change of generation. But they've got the priorities that are right. And the worship
I keep
style.
telling Clay to quit dress that way.
No, it's Ronnie. I have a rule. Hey, I have a rule. Anyone over 40 should never wear white sneakers ever, especially preaching them. And so that's yeah. I'll just let that go. But yeah.
Okay.
I'm so excited.
Sorry, Bryant.
I'm so excited about this next generation. We've had an increase in baptism this past year, and for 10 years, I've been sharing with folks in light of the church planting movement in our convention that I feel like there was going to be a bottoming out at some point because you got a lot of older, dead churches in rural communities where the rural communities are dying, and we need to plant churches, especially in metropolitan areas. So I'm excited about that. I'm hoping this will be a trend. These Gen Z kids, they are looking to be challenged. They don't want an easy Christianity. They're going to be more like what I saw happening with Christians in California and Pacific Northwest for much of my adult life. If you're a Christian there, you're really choosing something that is countercultural and being different. These recent baptisms at Auburn, at Alabama, at UGA, at Tennessee, these are state universities. Man, that is so exciting. God's up to something great because our generation, the sorriest generation in the history of America, we made a mess of things. And so Gen Z has an opportunity to come to the Lord because now the gospel is so needed and it's going to be so powerful in a culture that is broken. The culture's broken. America's broken. And I'm not saying that with any political party bent. Clay can tell you that. It's not an either or. It's both are broken. Everything's broken.
Yeah.
But the Gen Z crowd is looking for substance. Don't compromise on walking strong in Jesus and all that entails. They love it. They want to hear it, but do it in a language that's authentic that they can understand. And I'm very hopeful. I really am. I'm very hopeful for the future. I imagine you guys will feel the same way.
Absolutely. Well, I want to thank you both. Thank you, Bryant, for giving us an hour of your time here and for your faithfulness in the ministry, your example to many of us. I'm grateful for that. I would encourage all of our listeners to check out Right from the Heart Ministries at rightfromtheheart.org. Please do so. You can hear all kinds of sermons from Bryant. Or go to sinrelief.org. Also, partner with Sin Relief as we are meeting needs all across the world. I'm grateful for Bryant's leadership there as well. I want to thank you for listening. If you're enjoying what you're hearing, if you've enjoyed today's podcast, please rate, review, and subscribe to the podcast on whatever platform you are listening on. When you do, it helps the podcast grow, and we're able to have more conversations just like this one with great leaders to help us get better as those leading the church. Thanks for listening today, and I'll see you on the next episode.
Take care.